Hello, my name is Andrew Spencer. I'm from the University of Cambridge, and I am talking today on the Leopard Prince, Lord Edward in the Barons' Wars 1264-5. Edward is the eldest son of King Henry III and goes on to become King Edward I, one of England's greatest monarchs. And this is looking at the formative period of his life between the battles of Lewes and Evesham, when he is imprisoned, he escapes dramatically, and then leads the Royalist army to victory at the Battle of Evesham and defeats and kills Simon de Montfort. And I'll be looking at contemporary and modern perceptions of Edward in his youth. There is a famous poem by a Montfortian called the Song of Lewes, which describes Edward as a leopard, brave but also a pard, also changeable and a liar. And I will look at that and also at the way in which Edward develops his ideas that he will take on in his long and successful reign after his father dies. Thank you.
So welcome to Dr. Andrew Spencer. And just to note, as a warning, Andrew, one of my questions at the end is, when did he become the Lord Edward?
Never. He was never the Lord Edward. It's just Lord Edward. There's no definite article in Latin. Anyway, thank you very much, and I'm delighted to be here, and I'm grateful for the invitation and for the very warm welcome and very wet welcome. But I'm going to take us to Friday the 13th of March 1271, and the cousin and closest friend of the future King Edward I of England entered the small church of San Silvestro in the busy market square of the papal city of Viterbo, about 50 miles north of Rome. Viterbo had been the base from which the last Pope, Clement IV, had masterminded the downfall of the Hohenstaufen kings of Sicily through the agency of his crusading champion, Charles of Anjou. But the papacy was currently in the midst of one of its periodic interregnums. There had been no Pope since Clement died two and a half years before. This cousin had been dispatched by Edward from Sicily, thus leaving the crusade of which Edward was one of the leaders, for two reasons. First, to accompany the funeral cortege of King Louis IX of France, who had died on the crusade at Tunis and was being taken back to Paris. Secondly, to try to conclude a peace with the surviving sons of Simon de Montfort, two of whom, Simon the Younger and Guy, had taken up service with Charles of Anjou in the Kingdom of Sicily, as Louise was telling us earlier. The cousin's name was Henry of Almaine, and he had come to hear Mass. Partway through the service, the two Montforts caught up with him. Henry sought refuge at the high altar, but was dragged from the church into the square. Henry begged for mercy, but Guy de Montfort told him that none would be forthcoming, as none had been shown to his father and to his brother at Evesham. As Henry was hacked to pieces, one of the party was heard to call out, "Remember Evesham." Unable to exact their revenge on Edward himself, Simon's sons had struck out at the closest available target. Ironically, neither Henry nor his father, Richard of Cornwall, had been at Evesham. But the battle's shadow was a long one and engulfed Henry on this Lenten morning in Italy. Young Simon died shortly after the murder, like Cain, cursed by God, a wanderer and a fugitive, according to one chronicler. But Edward pursued Guy and the other surviving Montfort brother, Aimery, for years. Guy escaped Edward's justice, but died in the prison of Edward's ally, the King of Aragon, during the War of the Sicilian Vespers in the 1280s, and ended up depicted in the seventh circle of hell by Dante, immersed in a river of boiling blood as eternal punishment. As far as Edward and the English royal family was concerned, there would have been something of a family reunion once Guy arrived in hell. The so-called Trinity Apocalypse manuscript, which David mentioned earlier, preserved in Trinity College, Cambridge, which may have belonged to Eleanor of Castile, wife of Edward I, is a Norman-French commentary on the Apocalypse, with lavish illustrations of the final battle against the forces of the Antichrist. Traditionally dated to circa 1255, the Oxford art historian Laura Slater has recently suggested a post-1265 dating because of the appearance of Simon de Montfort in the armies of the beast. Folio 23R, which appears on the front cover of David Carpenter's hardback version of The Struggle for Mastery, depicts Montfort in the hordes of the enemy. You can see him there, unhelmed, hunched, with a fearful expression, his shield pale and colourless. Slater argues that the artist, in a, quote, mocking undertone, portrays Montfort as a fearful minion in the army of the beast, rather than one of its bloodthirsty leaders. On the next page, we see the armies defeated, and there, on the top of the pile, his body being pecked at by carrion birds, his sword unheroically still scabbarded, lies the Montfort figure from the last illustration. While the royal family might mock Simon, the memory of the violent disturbances of civil war remained a fear buried only just below the surface. In September 1297, at the height of the political and constitutional crisis that year, the chancery clerks around Prince Edward, regent while Edward I was fighting in Flanders, wrote to all the mayors of major towns and to constables of royal castles in England, telling them that, quotes, the king revolves in his mind how some persons in times past withdrew themselves from the late king and from him, and what evils arose thence to the realm and to its inhabitants, unquote. And it ordered them to prevent any assemblies of potential rebels in their towns. Undoubtedly, King Edward must have reflected out loud on the return of the troubled times of his youth before he had set sail for Flanders, and this was being repeated by the chancery clerks. As late as 1322, in the aftermath of the execution of Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, the spectre of the 1260s was once again being raised by those around the king, at this time Edward II. The Statute of York, which abolished the so-called ordinances of 1311 that, like the provisions of Oxford before them, had placed swingeing restrictions on royal power, reflected that in time past, by such ordinances and provisions made by subjects against the royal power of the ancestors of our Lord the King, troubles and wars have happened in the realm, whereby the land hath been in peril. Elsewhere, I've described this as the Crown's historiography of the 13th century, that the disturbances of that turbulent century had occurred because the king's subjects had sought to restrict and to bind his power. Fear was still mixed with mockery, however, as they often are. Edward II engaged on a victory tour of the property of northern rebels that he had taken into his hands, and in September 1322 was at Walton Castle in North Yorkshire. The court was entertained there by two local minstrels, Agnes the Redhead and Alice of Walton, who sang tales of Simon de Montfort and other songs, for which they received the princely sum of 4 shillings, the equivalent of more than a month's wages for a labourer. These incidents, the last nearly 70 years after Evesham, remind us that the shadow of those events and of Simon himself stalked the consciousness of the royal family long after Simon's body had been dismembered. The period of reform and rebellion, which culminated in the Barons' War, was a crucible in which, for better or worse, much of Edward's future life and attitude to kingship was formed. Rather than simply telling the story of Edward's war, it is this that I want to focus on most closely in my talk. In order to do so, however, it is necessary to give a brief précis of Edward's career up to the Battle of Lewes on the 14th of May, 1264. Born in June 1239, Edward entered political life in 1254 with his marriage to Eleanor of Castile, a marriage which safeguarded Gascony for Henry III. As part of the marriage arrangement, Henry agreed to provide Edward with lands worth £10,000 a year. His appanage encompassed Gascony itself, nearly all crown lands in Ireland, the Channel Islands, Bristol, Stamford and Grantham, the earldom of Chester, together with the 3 castles in Monmouthshire, and Montgomery, Cardigan, Carmarthen, and Wilth, elsewhere in Wales. So great was Edward's endowment that Matthew Paris felt that Henry had left himself a mutilated king because of it. It was here on the marches of Wales, however, that Edward's first political test came, a test he failed spectacularly. In late 1256, Llywelyn ap Gruffydd, Prince of Gwynedd, attacked and overran the four cantrefs in North Wales. The following summer, a royal army under Edward's lieutenant was defeated at the Battle of Cadfan in Carmarthenshire. Edward, left by Henry to deal with the crisis without royal support, was outmatched by the battle-hardened Llywelyn and turned for support to his uncles, the Lusignans, half-brothers of Henry III. They bailed him out, but his transition from his mother's tutelage to the camp of her rivals was one of the catalysts for the coup of 1258. Edward tried and failed to protect the Lusignans in 1258, but by 1259, he was in alliance with Simon de Montfort, attracted partly by the ideas of reform in the air, but also probably by Simon's glamour. One of his main aims was independence from his parents, as with all teenagers, and from the baronial council. He reached an accommodation with Henry and Eleanor in 1261, as part of Henry's reassertion of royal power in that year. This came at the expense of his friends, including a group of marcher lords, anathema to his mother, who were banished from his presence and persecuted. Edward spent much of the following 2 years in France, in Gascony, and on the tourneying circuit, while the situation in England and Wales deteriorated under Henry's rule. In 1263, Edward's former friends invited Simon to return, leading to the brief reinstatement of the provisions of Oxford in the summer of 1263. The autumn saw Edward win back his marcher friends to his side, and he had quickly become, at the age of 24, the leading military figure on the royalist side. Following the failure of Louis IX's arbitration, one of the first actions of the Civil War saw Edward besieged in Gloucester Castle by Robert de Ferrers, the Earl of Derby, and Henry de Montfort, eldest son of Earl Simon. Edward, in a desperate fix, agreed to a truce, and the baronial forces withdrew. Edward proceeded to break the truce and plundered the town, before proceeding to play a major role in the royalist victory at Northampton, intervening to save the life of young Simon de Montfort. While Henry moved south to relieve Rochester Castle, Edward continued to ravish the estates of his enemies in the Midlands, before rejoining his father at the captured castle of the Earl of Gloucester at Tunbridge in Kent. From there, they made their way to Lewes in Sussex, stronghold of Earl Warenne, one of Edward's closest friends. At Lewes, Edward commanded the royal right and found himself opposite the London contingent of Montfort's army. The Londoners had grievously insulted his mother the previous autumn, pelting her barge from London Bridge as she made her way upstream from the Tower to Windsor. Edward was set upon revenge and, having broken the Londoners, pursued them off the field. By the time he returned, the battle was done, and Henry was holed up in the Priory. Some of Edward's companions left the battle at this point, making for Pevensey Castle and then for France. But Edward determined to join his father. It appears that he wished to continue the battle the next day, but perhaps trusting on the return of his companions. But the king and the other royalists preferred the path of negotiation, which led to the Mise of Lewes. Edward and his cousin Henry of Almaine were hostages for the agreement until a final settlement could be agreed. The first phase of Edward's career thus ended in utter disaster. It is worth spending some time reflecting on the impression that the young Edward made, both on contemporaries and on modern commentators. For R.F. Treharne, the most ardent of Montfort's academic admirers, Edward was, quotes, an irresponsible, arrogant, and headstrong boy, treacherously selfish in the heedless pursuit of his own ends, indulging whim at every pleasure, and incapable of self-discipline, which reads like a terrible school report from the headmaster. Among Edward's biographers, the view is somewhat more sympathetic, though still generally critical. Michael Prestwich sees Edward's early career as full of contradictions. He can be seen as acting in a willful way, changing sides in an irresponsible fashion, and also as the man who did most to salvage the monarchy from an appallingly difficult situation. Mark Morris, while finding much to admire in Edward's cunning and courage, can't help but admit his perfidy. Morris comments on how Edward's low reputation amongst contemporaries at this point in his life, focusing particularly upon the Song of Lewes, a long Latin poem written during the period of Montfort's ascendancy after the Battle of Lewes. And the author describes Edward as such: a lion by pride and fierceness, he is by inconstancy and changeableness a pard, changing his word and promise, cloaking himself by pleasant speech. When he is in a strait, he promises whatever you wish, but as soon as he has escaped, he renounces his promise. This passage comes from a section of the poem immediately after a vigorous defense of Simon's motives, and there is a clear contrast made between the two men. The faith and fidelity of Simon alone has become the security and peace of all England, the author claims, while Edward relies on treachery or falsehood to advance his position. Edward, because of his pride, seeks no one's glory but his own, while Simon, like unto Christ, gives himself to death for the many. Because Simon fights for God, justice and truth, his enemies are not just his enemies, but those of the English nation as a whole, the church, and by extension, God himself. It was the righteousness of Simon and of his cause that gave him and his Gideon-sized army victory over the multitudes of the royalist host at Lewes. We shall return to the Song of Lewes later in the talk to reflect upon its arguments and the extent to which Edward was and would prove the type of prince that the author desired. But for now, we will turn to the events between Lewes and Evesham. The author of the song is very keen to defend Simon and his family from any accusations of greed. I've got a bit of a long quote here. They call Simon a misleader and deceiver, but his deeds test him and prove him truthful. If it was his own advantage which had moved the earl, he would have had no other zeal, nor would he have sought with his whole intent for the reformation of the realm, but a designing for lordship would seek its own advancement alone. And he would set before him the advancement of his own friends, would aim at the enrichment of his sons, and would neglect the safety of the community, and would veil the poison of falsehood with the cloak of duplicity. Thus, he would abandon the faith of Christianity and would subject himself to the law of a terrible penalty, nor would he escape the weight of the storm. I've highlighted that being read, and we'll come back to that later. Simon, like any baron, had always an eye to his own interest in his dealings with the king, and had not hesitated to use his position to advantage, both before and during the period of reform and rebellion. This instinct, however, went into overdrive in the months after Lewes. It is idle speculation to wonder whether the author of the song was writing before Simon began enriching himself and his family at the expense of the royal family and the royalist barons, or whether he knew and was protesting too much. Taking the Montfort children first, before we move on to the big fish himself, the eldest, Henry, was made Constable of Dover and Warden of the Cinque Ports. Esgeta, south of the Trent, which enabled him to control all lands that reverted to the crown before they were redistributed. Young Simon was given the castles of Gloucester, Nottingham, Porchester, Earl Warren's lordship of Lewes in Sussex, to which he added by extortion the neighbouring lordship of Bramber from the royalist baron William de Breauz, and spent much of the winter of 1264-5 trying unsuccessfully to abduct the wealthy heiress Isabella de Fours, Countess of O'Male and Devon. Guy was granted custody of the southwestern estates of the immensely wealthy Richard of Cornwall, the king's brother. The clerical brother, Aimery, was, while still only in minor orders, got a number of rich benefices, including the treasurership of York Minster, one of the wealthiest non-episcopal benefices in the land. The 7-year-old daughter, Eleanor, was betrothed to Llewellyn ap Griffith, a man in his mid-40s, who had become a vital ally of Simon since 1263 in their joint struggle against the English crown. Many smaller fiefs fell into the hands of Montfort and his sons, and the records give occasional glimpses of their acts of petty or gross extortion, such as the £1,000 demanded by Henry de Montfort from Robert de Stuteville for his release from Henry's custody. You may have some idea of where Eleanor got all that money that she shipped overseas. It was Lord Edward himself, then, whom Earl Simon targeted most ruthlessly now that he was in his power. Following Lewes, Edward was taken first to Dover Castle and then to Wallingford in Oxfordshire, where he was placed under the care of his aunt, Simon's wife, Eleanor. A new scheme of government was agreed at Parliament on the 24th of June, pending the hoped-for arbitration of King Louis IX. By mid-August, when this was not forthcoming, the scheme was confirmed, quotes, to last throughout the life of our Lord the King, and also during the reign of Lord Edward, when he shall have become king, until a date which shall be settled hereafter. In other words, there was no prospect of an end to Edward's intolerable position. While Simon's regime attracted international opprobrium, becoming in effect a rogue state, Queen Eleanor's attempted invasion 1264 failed to materialize, and it seemed unlikely that sufficient help would come from abroad to overturn the situation. Both Simon and Edward realized that if the former were to be overthrown, it would most likely come from the regime's internal enemies, and that Edward was the obvious figurehead. Many northern lords and most of the Marcher lords refused summonses to court, while some of Edward's household knights continued to hold Bristol for him, and other royalist garrisons also held out, most significantly at Pevensey in Sussex, where young Simon, when not chasing after Isabella de Fours, was bungling the siege there. Edward's position was becoming awkward for Simon. He had surrendered as a hostage until a permanent peace had been agreed. He'd not been taken in battle. The August 1264 settlement, which had confirmed the scheme of government proposed in June, had been, quotes, approved by the Lord King and Lord Edward, his son, unquotes, and therefore the justification for Edward's continued incarceration was beginning to run thin. Gilbert Clare, the Earl of Gloucester, and the bishops were arguing for Edward's release. On the 6th of October, Roger Mortimer and the other Marcher lords were told that their continuing resistance was preventing Edward's release. Montfort's embarrassment at the continued detention of Edward was made acute by a daring rescue attempt. The chronicler Robert of Gloucester relates that the Queen had heard that her son's guard at Wallingford was a weak one, and she wrote to his supporters in Bristol, urging them to break Edward out. On a Friday morning, unfortunately, he doesn't provide a date, just the day of the week, at first light, they gathered at All Hallows Church to the west of Wallingford Castle. From there, Robert tells us, quotes, the first ditch they took and broke the outmost wall and came within, unquotes. This naturally roused the garrison, who, with crossbow and with other engines, held fast against them. Fearing that that might not be enough to deter Edward's knights, the garrison, quotes, said to them that were without, that unless they would depart, they would glad send Sir Edward out to them, bound with a mangonel, to take home with them. Naturally perturbed at this threat to be flung from the walls in such a manner, Edward appeared, and according to Robert, told his friends to go home again, or he was a dead man of truth. We can but speculate on the humiliating and terrifying effect that this might have had on Edward. But for now, our purposes are the effect that it had on Simon. Montfort arranged for Edward, Henry of Almaine, and Richard of Cornwall to be moved to his own castle of Kenilworth, in better ward to do, as Robert of Gloucester puts it. There's a lovely picture of Kenilworth. The rescue attempt may well have been coordinated with a move by the Marchers to seize a number of royal castles in early November. Within a month, however, Simon had turned the tables and, in conjunction with Llewellyn ap Griffith, had pincered his enemies and forced them to come to terms at Worcester. With the marches subdued and peace finally restored, the release of Edward could no longer be delayed. Writs were sent out on the 14th of December for a parliament to meet in London on the 20th of January, 1265, which Sophie was telling us about earlier. Quotes, to provide happily for Edward's deliverance and to confirm and finally complete the full security and tranquility of peace, to the honour of God and the advantage of the whole realm, which we do not wish to settle without your counsel. That's in Henry's words. Simon was taking no chances, however. Parliament was only to ratify the agreement by which Edward was to be released, not to advise on its contents. If Edward were to be freed, then he had to be defanged. Much of the prince's appanage, Ireland, the Channel Islands and Gascony lay already beyond his reach, were he to be released into Montfortian England. Simon could feel confident that his ally, Llewellyn, who remained in the ascendancy in Wales, would continue his track record of success against Edward there. This left Edward's English lands as the only significant power base from which he might challenge Simon's supremacy. On the 18th of December, just 4 days after the writs of summons for the January Parliament were dispatched, Simon began to dismantle Edward's English inheritance. That day, Bristol Castle was surrendered to Simon. On Christmas Eve, Edward granted the earldom of Chester to Simon, quotes, in exchange for certain lands which the Earl has assigned to him, of the same value. The Lordship of the Peak was also surrendered to Simon. John Madicott has estimated that the value of these lands was around £1,500 a year, and that the lands Edward received in return 5 months later, on the 16th of May, were a scattered series of manors worth around £500. The agreement made in Parliament on the 11th of March, 1265, therefore, was only for show in more ways than one. Edward and Henry of Almaine were, according to an eyewitness account, brought before the king, Simon, and quotes, all the people in the king's great hall at Westminster. At the same time, the chronicler continues, there were read certain letters obligatory of his lordship the king and Lord Edward, in which is set forth and under what penalties they upon oath had promised to maintain the peace and tranquility of the realm. And then 9 bishops, arrayed in pontificals with lighted tapers, pronounced excommunicate all those who should presume to do aught against the charters of liberty and the forest, or against the statutes which had been enacted in the previous year. Thus far, thus humiliating for Edward. Yet more was to come. More letters were read by which the heir to the throne surrendered 3 more Welsh castles to be held as surety for his good conduct by the trustworthy Montfortians for 3 years. Edward was to be confined to England during this period and was to support the government against the Marchers if they proved recalcitrant. He could bring no foreigners to England, and they must resist any that came to the utmost of his power. And faithfully to observe all these things, the chronicler concluded, he bound himself upon peril of all the lands, tenements, honours and dignities which he then possessed or should possess if he should contravene any one of the articles aforesaid. We should not underestimate the effect that this humiliating dumb show must have had on Edward in both the short and the long term. In the words of the official communication sent in Henry's voice around the country, quotes, it is our express wish that if we or Edward our son should ever venture in any way to go against this ordinance, our promise or our oath, which God forbid, or to disturb the peace and quiet of our kingdom, then it shall be lawful for all in our kingdom to rise against us and to do all in their power to help to inflict injury upon us, unquote. In effect, this legalized rebellion against the king, going further even than the security clause of Magna Carta in 1215, which had both offered the king the chance to amend his error before rebellion was permitted and had saved the person of the king and the royal family from injury. Such a thing had shamed the English nation in 1215, according to Pope Innocent III, And now the people, led by Montfort, had gone even further. What's more, unlike Magna Carta in 1215, where John had taken grave pains to restrict dissemination of the contents as much as possible, this lengthy concession was sent far and wide to be read out loud to as many people as possible. At no point had the authority of the English crown sunk so low, and Edward had been forced to participate and silently to assent to it. As the author of the Flores Historiarum put it, Henry could not be, quotes, considered anything more than a shadow of a name. Sophie Ambler has rightly suggested that all this came from Simon and his willingness to humiliate, as she puts it, a characteristic present throughout his career and especially in his dealings with Henry and his family. Edward was not Henry III, however, and Simon became the first of Edward's many enemies to underestimate him throughout his long career. Edward would not forget, nor even were the terms of the agreement adhered to. Edward was not released in any meaningful sense. Instead, he remained under the close supervision of Simon and his most trusted men, and indeed women, as Louise showed us. When the Abbot of Dryborough in Scotland was sent by Edward's sister, Queen Margaret of Scotland, to speak with her brother while he was being held at Hereford Castle, that's where the green is, basically the castle is where the green is, there's the cathedral over there. Simon met the abbot and personally conducted him to the prince, who was being held high up in the towers, going in front of the abbot so that no message could be passed between them at the moment of greeting. Simon remained with them throughout the interview and, quotes, did not turn his eyes from one nor the other, but watched them both continuously, unquote, according to the Melrose chronicler, who would have had the report from the abbot himself. Edward's humiliation thus continued. The seeds of Edward's salvation, however, were sown in the means by which Simon had effected his humiliation. The Peak District, which Edward had been forced to hand over, was also claimed by Robert de Ferrers, the Earl of Derby, Edward's former ward, with whom he had been fighting a private war in 1264. In the summer of 1264, with Edward imprisoned, Derby had overrun many of the estates of Edward, including the Peak District. At the Hilary Parliament in 1265, Montfort demanded that the Earl should surrender the castle of the Peak, of the High Peak, as per the agreement with Edward, into Simon's custody. Derby refused and was arrested and thrown into the Tower of London, a blatant breach of Magna Carta. Such a naked power move by Simon against a powerful rival who stood in the way of his territorial ambitions spooked young Gilbert de Clare, Earl of Gloucester, the greatest magnate in England outside the royal family. Gilbert resented the appropriation of the spoils of Lewes by Simon, and especially his sons, whom he hated. He begrudged Montfort's control over government, and they had fallen out over the rights to a prisoner. Together with these personal resentments, Gilbert had important policy disagreements too, over the treatment of Lord Edward, Simon's continued use of foreigners, and his failure to observe the provisions of Oxford and the Mise of Lewes fully. Gilbert feared that Derby's fate would be his and withdrew from court, as David was telling us earlier. While he played for time in the marches, events began to move in Edward's favour. First, the marchers had not departed for Ireland, as per the agreement, but remained on the march. Second, a small force under the command of William de Valence and Earl Warenne landed in Pembrokeshire and made their way inland to join up with the Marcher Lords. Third, Simon moved west to Gloucester with the king and Edward in order to negotiate with Earl Gilbert, thus bringing Edward closer to his friends. Finally, Gilbert had an agent who possessed Simon's trust. This was Thomas de Clare, Gilbert's younger brother, and it was he, in conjunction with Roger Mortimer, who effected Edward's escape from Hereford. The dramatic episode rested on the kind of dissimulation that the author of the Song of Lewes deplored, with Edward riding each of his guards' horses to exhaustion before taking off on the one remaining fresh mount to a waiting servant of Roger Mortimer's, who conducted Edward to Wigmore Castle. Over the next few weeks, Edward and his allies comprehensively outgeneraled both Simon and his son, young Simon, who brought a force from the southeast to join up with his father. At Evesham, following the advice of Vegetius, Edward even left Simon's men a potential route of escape as a means of sowing confusion among them. In the battle itself, Edward's chief act was to rescue his father, whom Simon had unchivalrically dressed in borrowed armor, perhaps hoping that his enemies would unknowingly deal the fatal blow that he could not or would not do himself. We have heard in detail, I think we may be hearing in even more detail, about what happened to Simon on the battlefield. To what extent was Edward responsible for the murder of Evesham, and how are we to judge him for it? Edward and Gloucester clearly planned Montfort's death, and they will have known, or at best guessed, and at worst intended, that many of his closest companions would die around him. As unprecedented as a slaughter of noble combatants was, Simon clearly knew that it was coming. The dragon banner, signalling that no prisoners were to be taken, had been unfurled at Lewes the year before. And as Sophie Ambler has noted, that was long before the worst humiliations had been heaped upon Edward and Henry. Simon was unreconcilable, both in his own eyes and in those of his enemies. He would not yield, and so he had to be extirpated. There was no other way out. What about the grisly dismemberment of Simon and the slaughter at and despoliation of the abbey? That Edward himself had led his wounded father from the field affords him little protection from criticism. He may not have been present for the dismemberment of Simon, but he did not intervene to stop Roger Mortimer from sending the worst marital present of all time to his wife. Nor is there any hint that he tried to intervene to stop the killing in the abbey. As commander, Edward must bear responsibility for the vengeful mood and for the acts that his men perpetrated. Vengeance ultimately is what it amounted to. Sophie's biography has vividly demonstrated the devotion that Simon's charisma attracted amongst his followers. We've seen some of that today. While John Madicott wrote of Simon's silver tongue in attracting supporters. For years, that tongue had cut Henry III, William de Valence, Henry of Almaine, and other enemies of Simon. That tongue had spoken through Henry the words of the humiliating surrender of the king and his eldest son in Westminster Hall, and had broadcast them across the kingdom. Simon had spied on Edward's private conversations, had robbed him of his lands, and his men had threatened to throw him from the battlements of Wallingford. At Evesham, Edward, Mortimer, and Gloucester cut back with steel far sharper than a silver tongue. The civil blood of Simon and his friends made Edward's civil hands unclean, to paraphrase Shakespeare, but that is the nature of civil war. The author of the Song of Lewes, when defending Simon against accusations of greed, had argued that had the earl been seeking his own advantage, then he would subject himself to the law of a terrible penalty and would not escape the weight of the storm. Simon had indeed, through his greed, neglected the safety of the community and veiled the poison of falsehood with the cloak of duplicity, to turn the words of the song against him. And the storm had indeed broken over his head, both literally and metaphorically, at Evesham on the day of the battle. We return then to the Song of Lewes. It is a document frozen in time from the months of Simon's ascendancy after the battle. We know nothing of the author other than to speculate that he was possibly a friar in the service of the Bishop of Chichester. How long did he live? Did he mourn Simon and the collapse of the regime that he had so exhaustively supported in 968 lines of rhyming Latin? What did he make of the man who became king in 1272 and ruled England for the next 35 years? Many of Simon's former baronial supporters, such as John Fitzjohn, John de Iville, and Nicholas Seagrave, reconciled themselves sooner or later with what had happened and found a place for themselves in the restored regime, even in Edward's own service. John de Vesci, the man who carried Simon's foot to Alnwick as a relic, as Sophie was telling us, became so trusted and valued by Edward I that after his death in 1289, as a mark of royal favour and esteem, Vesci's heart was buried alongside those of Edward's son Alfonso and his wife Eleanor in Blackfriars Church in London. The Dunstable Analyst, on the other hand, was slower to recognise any virtues in Edward. In 1274, he wrote of Edward's 100 Rolls inquiry, where the king sought to establish what royal rights had been usurped and what wrongs had been committed in recent years, that, quotes, no good came of this. The following year, however, he admitted that at the Westminster Parliament, Edward passed some good laws, especially against the Jews. From this point, criticisms of the king disappear from the annals. By 1290, the annalist was praising the king's, quotes, hard work and goodness of character in preventing civil war in Scotland between the supporters of Bruce and Balliol. The previous year, he wrote of the king's return from a 3-year sojourn in France that, in all his doings, King Edward behaved so sensibly and courteously that his fame went out unto all the lands. If we had kept silent about it, the very stones would have shouted it aloud, unquote. Given the nature of the annals, written up year by year or in slightly longer sections, rather than through composed by a single author, it is very likely that these words were penned by a different author than the pro-baronial writer of the 1260s. But at the very least, they demonstrate the transformation of Edward's reputation in the eyes of this Montfortian monastic house. To what extent, though, had Edward really changed? Historians have recognized the parred elements in Edward's character that the author of the song described as persisting throughout the rest of his life. And there would be plenty, from Robert de Ferrers, the Earl of Derby, Roger Bigod, the Earl of Norfolk, the Archbishop Winchelsea, to Llewellyn ap Griffith, John Balliol, and William Wallace, who would agree with such a judgment. To what extent, though, were the qualities Edward were to display as king present too in his early life? Royalist arguments during the period of reform and rebellion tend to be both rarer and rather more laconic than those put forward by the reformers. In part, this was because Simon and his followers were much more eloquent than their opponents, in part because he numbered so many learned men amongst his supporters, and finally, because they had a much tougher job justifying what they were doing, as it went against all established principles of government north of the Alps. Henry's arguments, placed before King Louis IX in the winter of 1263-4, were simply that the king had the right to choose his councillors, that he had been prevented from doing this, and that the reforms had gone against his coronation oath. One royalist chronicler dismissed the provisions of Oxford even more simply as, quotes, delirious ravings. The final section of the Song of Lewes weighs up the arguments put forward by the king and his barons. The barons' justifications can be summarized in the following ways. The barons design nothing against the king's honor, but were, quotes, zealous to reform and magnify the kingly state. They who guard the king are his servants. They had a duty to purge the land of all errors if the kingdom is deformed. Kings needed to take counsel, as only God, who was without error, could rule without counsel. The king should take counsel from those who have the will and knowledge and power to be a profit to the kingdom, men to whom the various customs of their country are known, who feel themselves injured if the kingdom is injured. If the king will not choose such men, then because it concerns the community that wretched men be not made guides of royal dignity, It is hence clear what ought then to be done. Restraining the king is not of slavery, but it is enlarging of the kingly virtue. So is the king's child preserved, that he may not be hurt, yet he becomes not a slave when he is constrained. Thus, he who is able to fall, if he be guarded, that he not fall, is aided by such guardianship to live freely. Amidst all the mental gymnastics of justifying restraining an adult king and an adult heir to the throne, however, we get glimpses of the type of kingship of which the author approves. A good king or good kingship takes counsel from the native magnates and keeps them in their rank. He does not hide his plans from the community. He does not oppress, but protects his people. He shows justice to all men, reverences the law, and knows how to rule himself. The author sums up the type of king he wished for in the following way. Would that one like unto King David may succeed, a prudent man and humble, who may not wrong his own. Verily one who would not hurt the people that were under him, but would spend on them the affection of love, and would seek the profit of his own salvation. Him the commons would not allow to suffer loss. John Madicott and others have demonstrated how Edward learned the lessons of baronial reform, in the words of a famous article, and in his kingship incorporated much of the reform program into his own program for government and justice. The preamble of the first Statute of Westminster in 1275, the first of Edward's great reforming statutes which completely transformed the common law, makes this plain. Lengthy quote here. These are the establishments of King Edward, son of King Henry, made at Westminster at his first Parliament General, after his coronation at the close of Easter in the 3rd year of his reign, by his council and by the assent of archbishops, bishops, abbots, priors, earls, barons, and the community of the land thereto summoned. Because our Lord the King greatly wills and desires to set to rights the state of his kingdom in the things in which there is need of amendment, and this for the common profit of Holy Church and the kingdom, and because the state of Holy Church has been ill-managed, and the prelates and religious of the land burdened in many ways, and the people otherwise treated, and the peace less kept than ought to be, and the laws abused and malefactors less punished than they ought to be, and for that people are less afraid to do wrong, the king has ordained and established the things underwritten, which he intends to be profitable and suitable for the whole kingdom. Note the sections in red, which highlights Edward's conception of good kingship. The king had recognized the kingdom's ills, consulted widely, and sought the community's consent to the plans which he regarded as the necessary remedy. But the solution was his. The statute was promulgated at Edward's first Parliament, and it was through Parliament that Edward ruled. For the first 20 years of his reign, there were 2 every year, where the king consulted, listened to the petitions of his people, drew up legislation to reform the law, gained consent for taxation, and dispensed justice. Edward's tent was a large one and encompassed former enemies as well as friends. And unlike his father, the king's friends as well as his enemies felt the edge of his justice if they stepped out of line. Edward did not learn the lessons of baronial reform, though, just after 1265. His youth was not necessarily characterized by an irresponsible changing of sides, but by a commitment to reform, justice, and good governance. These, however, were to be on his terms, not those of Simon de Montfort. The Cambridge historian Caroline Burt, picking up on earlier thoughts of John Madicott, has argued that Edward's early years, quotes, displayed an identifiable and consistent sense of purpose. These can be summarized as a desire to have freedom of action, defense of the crown's rights in France and Wales, and a recognition of the king's duty to do justice. All are strong themes of Edward's kingship as well as of his apprenticeship. Edward first demonstrated the last point on justice in a private letter sent to his justiciar in Chester in August 1259, where he wrote that, quotes, "If common justice is denied to any one of our subjects by us or by our bailiffs, we lose the favor of God and man, and our kingship is belittled. Many years ago, Rod Billow has recently demonstrated the extent of Edward's keen and direct interest in judicial matters in the years before he became king, and that while his justice was neither perfect nor exemplary, he was, quotes, aware of his important responsibilities and driven by a clear moral imperative to dispense good justice to all who sought it. Reform did not have to come in the shape of Earl Simon. It could come in the form of Lord Edward, the true heir to the throne. This was the conclusion that the Earl of Gloucester came to in 1265, and it is hard to argue that he was wrong. Earl Gilbert made Edward swear to abide by the good ancient laws of England, to abolish evil customs in the realm, to induce the king to banish aliens, and to rule with the counsel of his faithful native subjects. This was a simple constitutional programme for good kingship, something all barons could support, and something which Edward largely followed well when he became king. Together, Edward and Gilbert de Clare proved that Montfortian and reformer were not necessarily the same thing. Reform thus became mainstream after 1265, but it was reform on Edward's terms. This was the other lesson that he took from the events of 1265. His purpose throughout his reign was the restoration of royal authority. This was very clear from the moment of his coronation, when he is said to have removed his crown and sworn never to wear it again until he had won back the crown's rights. He was determined never again to find himself in the dreadful situation of 1264-5, and thus he always met opposition, be it from his native subjects, the Welsh, the Scots, or the King of France, with the pride and fierceness of the lion that the author of the song identified, and was prepared still to, in a strait, promise whatever you wish, but as soon as he escaped, renounce his promise. Edward I was clever enough and determined enough to avoid ever returning to the depths of 1264-5. But the arguments of the Song of Lewes, like the ghost of Simon de Montfort, did not die and continued to haunt the monarchy. In 1327, Edward's son, Edward II, was deposed, and his deposition articles explained that this was done because, quotes, the king is incompetent to govern. Throughout his reign, he has been controlled and governed by others who have given him evil counsel, without his being willing to see or to understand what is good or evil, or to make amendment, or his being willing to do as was required by the great and wise men of his realm, or to allow amendment to be made. By his cruelty and lack of character, he has shown himself incorrigible, without hope of amendment. I always tell my students that they should hope that that doesn't turn up in their supervision reports. The sense that Edward had chosen the wrong counsellors and would not listen to the right ones was a powerful one and echoes the very reasoning of the Song of Lewes. In 1386, the Royalist view was put starkly by Richard II when facing calls from the Commons for the removal of his Chancellor and Treasurer. The chronicler Henry Knighton wrote that when this was reported to Richard, he ordered them to keep quiet about these matters and to proceed with Parliament's business and to hurry up, saying that he would not remove the lowest kitchen boy from his post in order to please them. Here we have the argument over counsel that lies at the heart of most of the instability in English politics in the later Middle Ages. There are two perfectly reasonable positions on counsel in the Middle Ages. The king should be able to choose his counsellors, and that he should take counsel from his native magnates. Successful kings like Edward I, Edward III, Henry V did both. Those who failed, from Henry III to Edward II and Richard II, did not and placed overwhelming emphasis on the first, forcing their magnates to retreat to the second position. It was a paradox that plagued England for centuries until, if I'm permitted to be terribly Whiggish to finish, Parliament finally decided
who advised the king in the glorious revolution of 1688.